We now continue our look at moral education. Jean-Jacques Rousseau provides a stark contrast to our good dead friend Aristotle, because their views of moral education and education in general are quite diametrically opposed. And we'll look at Jean-Jacques Rousseau's view on its own merits, but also do some comparisons between his view and that of Aristotle. Little background for Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He was born June 28th, 1712, in Geneva, Switzerland. He died on July 2nd, 1778, and is of course still dead today. He had a bit of a tragic backstory. His mother died shortly after he was born. His father fled Geneva to avoid prison, and he was pretty much largely on his own apparently after that. Like any young European seeking fame and fortune, he went to Paris, and went there in 1742, and worked a variety of jobs. And then he began writing. And of course his written works are his claim to fame. In 1750, he wrote, or rather published, Discourse on the Arts and Sciences. In 1754, he wrote Discourse on the Origin and Basis of Inequality Among Men, showing that discourse was a popular part of titles. Our good dead friend Descartes did a discourse as well, and also long titles were the vogue, apparently. In 1755, he wrote the Discourse on Political Economy. In 1761, the New Heloise. In 1762, Emile or Education, and this is the one we're looking at. And then his most famous work is best known in 1762 is the Social Contract, or Principles of Political Right. Now, in addition to his philosophy of education, he has an extensive view of society, political philosophy, social philosophy, etc., even a bit of anthropology. And all of this is important to putting his view of moral education in context. So, Rousseau is known to being very focused on emotions and passions, on the feelings. He also seems to embrace, or definitely embraces, a popular view during the time period he was writing, the concept of the noble savage. Although there's a variety of conceptions of this, when the Europeans were arriving in what we now call North America, they encountered the people already living here, and in some ways, sort of early on, some would characterize the people already living here as noble savages, as savage, uncivilized by European standards, but also noble, somehow being, better than the Europeans, at least in their nobility, well, in certain limited ways. This was popular in the fiction of the time, and certain fiction of the time, and if you read works of fiction about what we now call North America during that time period, you would often see that characterization of the noble savage. Again, both savage and noble. Now, Rousseau regarded all of humanity as sort of like originally being noble savages, and what this means for him is this. Going back to the question of moral education in general, are people naturally good, naturally evil, neutral, a mix? How does that work? He comes down, at least initially, early in his writings, as taking people to be naturally good. And he characterizes humans as being noble savages when in the state of nature. And the state of nature was, or probably still is, a sort of thought experiment in which you would look at what would be the conditions with humans before civilization. Humans pre-law, pre-society, pre-all that, just humans in the wild. Now, there is a question, of course, of whether that ever historically took place, but of course, this sort of theoretical thought experiment doesn't require that humans actually ever lived without society, civilization, etc., because you can think about, hypothetically, what would it be like if humans just, arose and had to build society, build rules, laws, etc. And this was a popular thing with thinkers during this time, like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, of course, since we're talking about him, but also John Locke and Thomas Hobbes and other thinkers in the political social field. So how do people become bad if they're born basically good? How does the noble savage become less noble and perhaps more savage? Well, this notion will probably seem familiar. Even to this day, there is a popular view that it is society, it is, civilization that corrupts us. So good people become corrupted by society, by civilization, because civilization, society, is both artificial and corrupt, according to him. Now, there are the obvious questions of if people are basically good and we build society, how does society become, corrupt? I mean, it's obviously artificial in a sense that we make it. Although there is this debate we talked about a bit when we looked at the method of the unnatural argument, what would count as artificial and what counts as natural? Because in a way, if we are natural creatures, then what we do is just as natural as any other creature, which leads to this, tangent of a debate about artificial versus natural. But we'll move back from that. So what he claims occurs is this. Once people get into society, our positive self-love gets transmuted into pride. And this pride, by its very nature, according to him, causes us to compare ourselves to others. We, instead of just having, positive self-love, like I love myself, I start looking at other people and comparing myself to them. And he believes, again, he's not basing this obviously on any empirical research, etc. He's speculating about the past for which we have no documentation. He claims this creates fear in people. We become afraid, apparently, of each other. And he claims this is what enables us to enjoy the pain and weakness of others. Because presumably, if they're suffering or if they're weaker than we are, then we can, feel better than them. We can see ourselves as being above them. So he infers that society is the cause of our unhappiness. Now, because of this view, he got in trouble with the Catholic Church in sort of like standard Catholic doctrine. But again, always check doctrine to see if it's being updated, and particular churches and sects do vary. But there was this conception of original sin, that Adam and Eve were in the Garden of Eden, then the apple is consumed, and the first humans gain the notion of good and evil, and the rest follows. And so Rousseau's view that people are naturally good conflicts with that, because on the doctrine of original sin, people start off with no knowledge of good or evil. They're neither good nor evil. Then they get the knowledge of good and evil, and then they're sinful, and they're kind of, bad. And so we had some conflict here with the church about this conception. And again, going back to the broad question in moral education and ethics in general, are people naturally good, naturally bad, neutral, mixed, etc.? He, in his earlier writings, takes people to be naturally good and corrupted by civilization. So in terms of our corruption, Rousseau addresses this in his work, The Discourse on the Arts and Sciences. Now, normally if you were to ask most people, have the arts and sciences been beneficial to humanity, people would tend to, in general, say probably yes. Although certain individuals would point out, things that they believe science has done badly or inflicted upon us. And with a little thought, anyone can, of course, find things that have occurred in the sciences that we have developed that have been, not so great for us. One could think of like atomic bombs, biological weapons, but maybe things like Facebook and Twitter, etc. But in general, people would tend to take a positive view of art and science. At the very least, people like things like having smartphones, having cars, having air conditioning, having indoor plumbing, etc. And even people who are against, science, they tend to rather like having air conditioning, heat, plumbing, supermarkets, etc., made possible by science. So why is Rousseau critical of the arts and sciences? Well, what he says, if you follow, politics at all, especially American politics, this will sound quite familiar. His view is that advances in arts and sciences have made governments more powerful, and this has been at the expense of individual liberty. Now, he was writing, back in the 1700s when high tech were things like, flintlock weapons, smoothbore, front loading, black powder cannons, sailing ships, and very basic machines. Now, today, if he was alive and saw things like satellites, drones, the internet, he would probably be, you can imagine his reaction at how, horrible he would see this given these views. Now, he is looked at, as objectively as possible. He is right about that although governments have long had considerable power over people, because they, control the military and the weapons and the institutions, etc. But of course, today we have governments that are incredibly powerful. They have satellites, cameras, drones, etc., and they can use all this to intrude into our liberty. Now, of course, the time when Rousseau was doing his stuff, there wasn't really a notion of like the modern corporation we have today, and it'd be interesting to speculate about his view about companies like Facebook and Google, and one could suspect that he would probably take a similar view, that although Facebook and Google are not government agencies, they do thus intrude into individual liberty with their technology, etc. So he sees the arts and sciences being generally negative. So what about material progress? Well, typically we tend to see this as, a good thing. People like having, say, refrigerators and stoves, microwave ovens, cars, etc. And although, again, some people may be critical of, things like Facebook and Google and that kind of stuff, they probably typically would not want to give up, say, their stoves and coffee makers and so on. Although, there are some people who do give up a lot of tech, but those people tend to be, pretty rare. So his concern about material progress is this. He argues that it undermines friendship. Why? Well, because now that we have stuff, lots of stuff, we can have jealousy, fear, and suspicion. Now, one could, of course, make the argument that this could occur, long before all these advances, but he believes that the greater material progress leads to greater jealousy, fear, and suspicion, and so he regards this as generally a bad thing. In Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Discourse on Inequality, he looks at humanity moving from the state of nature to what he calls artificial society. And again, this kind of thought device is to consider what humans would be like, hypothetically, before they have society, civilization, rules, laws, etc. Now, Jean-Jacques Rousseau obviously is not really operating on empirical data, deep scientific investigation, a lot of speculation. And so he seems to believe that the earliest humans, the first humans in this state of nature, were ape-like beings. However, they differed from other animals in two critical ways. One is free will, and second, the ability to improve, perfectibility. He believed that these early humans possessed a drive for self-preservation, which seems reasonable. Most creatures are such that if you try to kill them, they try to get away or try to kill you right back. And he claims, interestingly enough, that early humans have a natural inclination to compassion. And there's considerable speculation about what early humans are like, and obviously we don't have written records from pre-written times, and so we kind of guess at what people were like. Current scientists tend to look at our closest relatives among other primates to see what we're like. And they speculate, for example, from chimpanzees or bonobos or other primates, and whether we're seen as being like, more compassionate creatures or not usually depends on what sort of scientific fad, to be honest, is dominating. And so there may be, for example, scientists who believe that we are naturally inclined to be compassionate, and they'll look at evidence in various primates and say, look, this shows that we're probably compassionate. Others will look at other, like chimpanzees, and say, no, we're more violent or warlike, etc. And again, this is speculation that our ancestors were like them, or we're like them naturally. And obviously there's great difficulty in speculating about what humans are like apart from civilization, society, etc., and what our natural inclinations are or are not. Although philosophers, of course, speculate about this, David Hume, interestingly, claimed that we do have a natural sympathy, that we have a passion for justice, and we have a natural inclination for sympathy. So in terms of where Rousseau would fit in this sort of like what people are like, he believes that we are driven by self-preservation, but we also have a natural inclination for compassion. And so this would be connected to the idea that people are basically, good. So what happened to change us? Well, Rousseau's hypothesis is that as the human population expanded, humans were forced together, and this altered us psychologically. And this alteration, again, this is all speculation on his part, is that we underwent a psychological change, so our well-being depended, in part, on the opinions that other people held of us, which is something that at least most of us have today, that we do consider, despite what people say they don't care what other people think about them, we do seem to care about what other people think about us, at least some people. So I saw this as a golden age. Then things went bad. Why did things go bad? Well, once again, it seems to be things that we typically are taught, like in school, are good things. I remember back in the ancient days when I was in, early school, K through, like 5th grade, etc., even all through high school, we were told about how agriculture was good, the development of, the plow and growing crops, metallurgy, which is working with metals, private property, division of labor, and these are all were presented, as I recall back all those years ago, presented as good things. Now, Jean-Jacques Rousseau thinks that these are, in a way, bad things. That once you have agriculture, you can have people growing crops, and this allows, for example, to create standing armies. And once you have metallurgy, people can work metal, and an obvious example of something potentially bad would be people can make armor and weapons, etc. Then once you get private property, you have things to fight about, and division of labor, of course, splits things up and creates problems as well. And he thinks all of this creates inequality, which does, or rather increases it, which does seem true. Once you have crops, metals, private property, division of labor, people would be less and less equal. Now he brings forth kind of an early conspiracy theory. He believes that the very first state, and again this is speculation on his part, he obviously doesn't have written records, etc., but he claims the very first state was a social contract, an agreement, literally a agreement among those in society, and he believes this was created by the powerful and wealthy. And of course that is a certain plausibility, since pretty much in every human society, the powerful and wealthy generally tend to make the rules. So he thinks this primal contract, and again, we obviously don't have a copy of it someplace, he sees it as flawed. And also, the conspiracy part, a trick on the part of the powerful and wealthy to make inequality an enduring aspect of society. So you get this early notion that the powerful and wealthy, right off the bat, were tricking people into accepting a contract that baked inequality into society. And that presented as, part of the contract, and also as a good thing. And as you might imagine, today that's a fairly common view. Even though people are somewhat critical of inequality in some cases, generally it's seen as, a positive thing. as practical matters. So what he proposes is to create an alternative to what he regards as this fraudulent, deceptive contract. And so he ends his, and this is an entire work, he ends it by claiming that the desire to be valued by others then becomes harmful to integrity and authenticity when society is marred in interdependence, hierarchy, and inequality. And so that's how things start to go bad. And now the social contract. This is his most influential work. It was influential during his time and still influences thinkers today, both on the left, political left, and also the political right. So once again, he has this theme that people are basically like good or compassionate or decent, and the general theme that people become bad due to society. And so what he thinks occurs is this. Humans start out in the state of nature, basically good, and what happens is this becomes corrupted and degenerates into a lawless state devoid of morality. Now, our good dead friend Thomas Hobbes, he starts off right off the bat with a state of nature being a lawless state devoid of morality. John Locke, our good dead friend, his state of nature is much nicer, and within it you have the right to life, liberty, and property. There are rules, and one of the main reasons in Locke's case is that Locke believes that, God takes, gives people essentially these natural rights. And in a way it's complicated, but the basic idea is that for Locke, the state of nature is not horrible, but not as good as society. And so Rousseau sees it as the state of nature, basically good, and then becomes something horrible, a lawless state without morality. And so when we have a lawless state devoid of morality, then we need laws to survive. And so we are, on his view, both in competition with each other, but also dependent on each other. We can't survive without others, but we also compete with them. And so our competition threatens our survival, and our dependence obviously threatens our independence. So how do we solve this problem? Well, Rousseau embraces the social contract model, hence the name. And various thinkers, John Locke, Thomas Hobbes, etc., embrace varying manifestations of this view. The gist of it in all cases is people contract, they agree to accept these rules. And so he thinks that by accepting a social contract, we can survive by having laws, etc., but we can also have some degree of liberty because we can have these rules in our contract that allow us independence. Now, one of Rousseau's major theoretical contributions was his notion of the general will. And for him, this is more than just like a consensus of people voting, etc. There is this, manifestation of the will of the people, expression that's used quite a bit. Today, we might talk about it in terms of the alleged wisdom of crowds, etc. And he thinks essentially that with this general will, if we follow this general will, this will protect us in the following way. That'll prevent individuals from being subordinated to the wills of others. So it provides us with supposedly protection from others, which is a classic problem in political philosophy. If one believes that it is a problem, if people are, subordinated to the wills of others, some people are definitely fine with that. But Rousseau thinks we should have protection against that. He also believes it ensures obedience. And the reason is that collectively, each of us is an author of the contract. So in terms of the foundation of, government, what is the justification for political authority, he believes sovereignty lies with the people. And this becomes a popular view both on the left politically and what we would call the right politically. And so Rousseau is influential, ultimately, well, not really ultimately because things aren't over yet, with thinkers like Marx, but also thinkers on the right, fascism, etc. So how does sovereignty and government work for Rousseau? Well, he thinks the purpose of the government is to exist to implement and enforce the general will, the will of the people. Now, his conception of government was that there should be small government, a small number of magistrates, and he rejects the idea of representative assembly. Instead, though, he advocates direct creation of laws. Now, in the past, when you had a large country, this, of course, would be kind of problematic, because how would you have direct creation of laws with millions of people? But one could say today this could be possible with technology. But there are obviously very practical concerns to deal with, like how would you have an entire population directly creating laws, and how would you get anything done, ensure fairness, etc. But Rousseau put a lot of faith in the general will. So the government is to do that stuff. We'll next turn to look at his theory of education.